Natalie stood at the gates of the Vanderford mansion, her heart racing as she took in the sprawling coastal estate. The imposing structure loomed before her, its Victorian architecture a stark contrast to the modern California landscape. She clutched her small suitcase tightly, feeling out of place in her simple dress and worn shoes. As the iron gates creaked open, Natalie made her way up the winding driveway. The meticulously manicured gardens seemed to whisper secrets of a life she could only imagine. The salty breeze from the nearby ocean carried the scent of wealth and mystery. At the grand entrance, Natalie hesitated before ringing the doorbell. The door swung open, revealing a stern-faced housekeeper who eyed her critically. "You must be the new nanny," she said, her voice as cold as the marble floors beneath them. "Mr. Vanderford is expecting you. Follow me." Natalie trailed behind the housekeeper, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous foyer. Artwork worth more than she'd ever earn in a lifetime adorned the walls, and crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across antique furniture. As they reached the study, Natalie caught her first glimpse of Thomas Vanderford. He stood by the window, a glass of amber liquid in hand, his silhouette framed by the setting sun. He turned slowly, his piercing blue eyes appraising her from across the room. "Miss Thompson, I presume," he said, his voice deep and controlled. "I trust your journey was uneventful." Natalie nodded, finding her voice. "Yes, Mr. Vanderford. Thank you for this opportunity." Thomas merely inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Winters will show you to your quarters. You'll meet Alice in the morning. I expect punctuality and discretion in all matters concerning my daughter." With that dismissal, Natalie followed Mrs. Winters to the east wing of the mansion. The housekeeper's clipped explanations of household rules and expectations blurred together as Natalie tried to process the enormity of her new situation. Her room, while modest compared to the rest of the house, was still larger than any she'd had before. A four-poster bed dominated one wall, while a writing desk and wardrobe occupied another. A small balcony overlooked the rose garden, offering a breathtaking view of the Pacific Ocean beyond. As night fell, Natalie unpacked her meager belongings, her mind racing with thoughts of what tomorrow might bring. She was determined to make a good impression on young Alice and prove her worth to the enigmatic Mr. Vanderford. The next morning, Natalie met Alice for the first time. The girl, barely 7 years old, peered at her from behind a curtain of dark hair, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Natalie knelt down to her level, offering a warm smile. "Hello, Alice. I'm Natalie. I'm going to be taking care of you for a while. Would you like to show me your favorite toys?" Alice hesitated, then nodded slightly. She led Natalie to a playroom filled with dolls, stuffed animals, and books. As they explored together, Natalie noticed the absence of family photos or any personal touches that might suggest a mother's presence. Over the next few days, Natalie worked to earn Alice's trust. She discovered that the girl was painfully shy, rarely speaking above a whisper. During their walks in the garden or quiet reading sessions, Natalie caught glimpses of loneliness in Alice's eyes that mirrored her own childhood experiences. One evening, as Natalie was tucking Alice into bed, the girl finally opened up. "Do you know when my mommy is coming back?" she asked, her voice trembling. Natalie's heart ached. "I'm not sure, sweetheart, but I know she loves you very much and wants to get better so she can be with you again." As Alice drifted off to sleep, Natalie resolved to do everything in her power to bring some joy into the child's life. Later that night, as Natalie prepared for bed, she noticed a leather-bound book peeking out from behind her wardrobe. Curious, she pulled it out and realized it was an old diary. The inscription inside read, "Property of Elizabeth Vanderford." Natalie's fingers trembled as she opened the diary, knowing she was about to step into a world of secrets she might not be prepared for. The first entry dated back 15 years, and as Natalie began to read, she felt herself being pulled into the mysterious past of the Vanderford family. As days turned into weeks, Natalie dedicated herself to caring for Alice. She recognized the child's need for stability and affection and made it her mission to provide both. Their mornings often began with walks along the private beach that bordered the Vanderford property. One particularly sunny day, Natalie decided to introduce Alice to the joy of building sandcastles. As they worked together, patting wet sand into turrets and moats, Natalie noticed a small smile playing on Alice's lips, a rare sight that warmed her heart. "What shall we call our castle, Alice?" Natalie asked, smoothing the walls of their creation. Alice thought for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Castle Friendship," she said softly, looking up at Natalie with a hint of hope in her eyes. Natalie beamed at her. "That's perfect. It's our special place." As they continued their beach excursions, Natalie gently encouraged Alice to open up about her feelings. She learned of the girl's fears of abandonment, her longing for her mother, and her confusion about her father's distant behavior. Natalie listened patiently, offering comfort and reassurance when needed. Back at the mansion, Thomas Vanderford couldn't help but notice the changes in his daughter. Alice's demeanor had shifted from withdrawn to cautiously optimistic. He observed from his study window as Natalie and Alice tended to a small garden they had started together, their laughter floating up to him on the breeze. One evening, as Natalie was preparing Alice for bed, Thomas appeared in the doorway. His usual stoic expression softened as he watched his daughter animatedly recount their day's adventures to her nanny. "It seems you've had quite the day," Thomas said, stepping into the room. Alice's eyes lit up at her father's presence. "Daddy, Natalie taught me how to plant sunflower seeds. Can we watch them grow together?" Thomas hesitated, clearly unused to such requests. He glanced at Natalie, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I suppose we could do that," he replied, his voice gruff but not unkind. As Natalie quietly excused herself from the room, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph. The ice around Thomas Vanderford was beginning to thaw, however slowly. The next morning, Thomas caught Natalie in the hallway. "Miss Thompson," he began, his tone formal, but less cold than before. "I wanted to express my gratitude for your positive influence on Alice. It's been some time since I've seen her so engaged." Natalie smiled warmly. "Alice is a wonderful child, Mr. Vanderford. She just needs someone to listen and understand her." Thomas nodded curtly, a flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossing his face before he turned and strode away. As the weeks progressed, Natalie found herself becoming more curious about the Vanderford family history. During her free time, she began to explore the lesser-used parts of the massive mansion. In a dusty corner of the east wing, she discovered a room that seemed frozen in time. Sheets covered most of the furniture, but Natalie's attention was drawn to a collection of photographs on an old writing desk. Lifting one, she saw a younger Thomas, with his arms around a beautiful woman, Alice's mother, she presumed. They looked happy, a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere that now pervaded the house. As she replaced the photo, Natalie's hand brushed against a small lever hidden beneath the desk's surface. With a soft click, a compartment sprang open, revealing a stack of old letters and documents. Natalie hesitated, knowing she was intruding on private family matters. But her curiosity got the better of her, and she began to skim through the papers. Most seemed to be old financial records, but one document caught her eye, a faded letter mentioning a hidden inheritance and rightful heir. Before she could read further, the sound of footsteps in the hallway startled her. Quickly, she replaced the documents and slipped out of the room, her mind racing with questions about what she had discovered. That night, as Natalie lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled upon something significant. The mention of a hidden inheritance nagged at her, but she was unsure of how to proceed with this information. As she drifted off to sleep, Natalie resolved to be more observant, to look for clues that might shed light on the Vanderford family secrets. Little did she know that her own past was intricately linked to the very mystery she sought to unravel, and that her presence in the mansion was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change all their lives forever. Natalie's discovery in the hidden room fueled her curiosity about the Vanderford family's history. She began to pay closer attention to her surroundings, noting the subtle tensions that sometimes arose when certain topics were broached during meals or casual conversations. One rainy afternoon, Thomas asked Natalie to help reorganize the library. As they worked side by side, sorting through stacks of old books and papers, Natalie's hand brushed against a worn leather folder tucked behind a row of encyclopedias. "Mr. Vanderford," she called out, holding up the folder. "I think I found something interesting." Thomas approached, his brow furrowed. As he took the folder from her, his face paled slightly. "I haven't seen these documents in years," he muttered, more to himself than to Natalie. Curiosity piqued. Natalie watched as Thomas spread the papers across the large oak desk. His eyes scanned the documents, a mix of emotions playing across his usually stoic features. "Is everything all right?" Natalie ventured to ask. Thomas looked up, seeming to remember her presence. He hesitated before speaking. "These are old family records. I had almost forgotten about them." As Natalie leaned in to look, her eyes widened. Among the papers was a family tree, and there, near the bottom, was a name that made her heart race. Thompson. "Mr. Vanderford," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's my last name." Thomas's gaze sharpened. "What did you say your full name was, Miss Thompson?" "Natalie Thompson," she replied, her mind whirling. I was orphaned as a child. I never knew much about my family." Thomas's expression shifted from surprise to something unreadable. He quickly gathered the papers, his movements betraying a hint of agitation. "I think that's enough for today, Miss Thompson. Thank you for your help." As Thomas hurried out of the library, Natalie was left with more questions than answers. The connection between her name and the Vanderford family tree couldn't be a coincidence, could it? Over the next few days, Natalie noticed a change in Thomas's behavior. He seemed more withdrawn, often watching her with a guarded expression when he thought she wasn't looking. She longed to ask him about what they had discovered, but something held her back. It was during one of her explorations of the mansion that Natalie stumbled upon another piece of the puzzle. In a seldom-used study, she found a locked drawer. Using a hairpin, a skill she had picked up in her orphanage days, she managed to open it. Inside was a stack of legal documents. As Natalie skimmed through them, her heart began to race. The papers detailed a vast fortune, separate from the Vanderford wealth that had been hidden away years ago. And there, in black and white, was her name, Natalie Thompson, listed as the rightful heir. Shock coursed through her veins. How could this be possible? She had grown up with nothing, bounced from one foster home to another, and now she was supposedly the heir to a fortune. As she delved deeper into the documents, a darker picture emerged. It appeared that Thomas's uncle, a man named Robert Vanderford, had orchestrated a complex scheme to hide this inheritance. The reasons were unclear, but the implications were staggering. Natalie's mind reeled. Should she confront Thomas with this information? What if he already knew? The thought that he might have hired her knowing her true identity made her stomach churn. As she carefully replaced the documents, Natalie heard footsteps approaching. She quickly closed the drawer and pretended to be dusting when Thomas entered the room. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice tight, "I didn't expect to find you here." Natalie turned, trying to keep her expression neutral. "I was just tidying up, Mr. Vanderford. This room looked like it could use some attention." Thomas nodded, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed. Well, I believe Alice is waiting for her afternoon lesson. You shouldn't keep her waiting." As Natalie left the room, she could feel Thomas's gaze boring into her back. The weight of her discovery pressed heavily on her conscience. She knew she should tell him what she had found, but fear and uncertainty held her back. That night, as Natalie lay awake in bed, her mind raced with possibilities. If she truly was the heir to this hidden fortune, how would it change her life? And more importantly, how would it affect her relationship with Thomas and Alice? The next morning, over breakfast, Thomas surprised Natalie by opening up about his own past. He spoke of a difficult childhood, of feeling isolated and pressured to live up to the Vanderford name. "I never wanted that for Alice," he said softly, his eyes distant. "But I fear I've made the same mistakes my father did." Natalie felt a surge of empathy for Thomas, seeing him in a new light. As she listened to him share more about his struggles and fears, she realized that the truth about her inheritance could shatter the fragile connection they were building. With each passing day, the secret weighed heavier on Natalie. She found herself torn between her growing affection for the Vanderfords and the knowledge that she might be entitled to a life-changing fortune. As she tucked Alice into bed each night, the guilt of her silence gnawed at her. Little did Natalie know that forces beyond her control were already in motion, threatening to expose the truth and upend the delicate balance of their lives at the Vanderford mansion. The calm that had settled over the Vanderford mansion was shattered one crisp autumn morning. As Natalie was helping Alice with her reading in the sunroom, the sound of tires crunching on gravel drew their attention. A sleek black car pulled up to the front of the house, and out stepped a man Natalie had never seen before. "Who's that?" Alice asked, peering out the window. Before Natalie could answer, Thomas strode into the room, his face a mask of barely contained irritation. "Alice, go to your room. Miss Thompson, please accompany her." As they left, Natalie caught a glimpse of the stranger being ushered into Thomas's study. The man's confident swagger and the way his eyes darted around, taking in every detail of the mansion's opulence, set off alarm bells in Natalie's mind. Later that evening, as Natalie was heading to her room, she overheard raised voices coming from the study. Curiosity got the better of her, and she inched closer to the door. "You can't just show up here unannounced, Jason," Thomas was saying, his voice tight with anger. "Come now, cousin," the other man, Jason, replied smoothly. "Is that any way to greet family? Especially when I'm here to help." Natalie's breath caught in her throat. Another Vanderford relative? And what did he mean by help? The next morning, Thomas introduced Jason to Natalie and Alice over breakfast. "This is my cousin, Jason Vanderford. He'll be staying with us for a while." Jason flashed a charming smile, his eyes lingering on Natalie a moment too long. "It's a pleasure to meet you both. I look forward to getting to know you better." Over the next few days, Jason made himself at home in the mansion. He was charming and attentive, especially towards Natalie, but something about him made her uneasy. She often caught him watching her with a calculating look in his eyes. One afternoon, as Natalie was walking in the garden with Alice, Jason approached them. "Miss Thompson, might I have a word?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes intense. Natalie hesitated, then nodded. "Alice, why don't you go pick some flowers for the dinner table? I'll be right here." As soon as Alice was out of earshot, Jason's demeanor changed. "I know about you, Natalie," he said, his voice low. "I know about your true connection to this family." Natalie's heart raced. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. Jason's smile was predatory. "Oh, I think you do. The hidden inheritance, the rightful heir. Ring any bells? I can help you claim what's yours. For a price, of course." Natalie felt a chill run down her spine. "I don't need your help," she said firmly. "And I think you should leave." Jason's eyes narrowed. "Don't be hasty, my dear. You're in over your head here. Thomas isn't the benevolent employer you think he is. He's known about your identity all along." Before Natalie could respond, she heard Alice calling for her. Jason stepped back, his face once again a mask of charm. "Think about my offer, Natalie. You'll need allies in the days to come." As Jason walked away, Natalie's mind reeled. How did he know about the inheritance? And was he telling the truth about Thomas? That night, Natalie noticed a change in Thomas's behavior. He seemed distracted and on edge, his eyes often darting to Jason during dinner. She wanted to confront him about what Jason had said, but fear held her back. What if Thomas really had known about her identity all along? What if her presence here wasn't a coincidence? The tension in the mansion continued to build over the next few days. Natalie caught snippets of hushed arguments between Thomas and Jason. She noticed Jason rifling through papers in Thomas's study when he thought no one was looking. And all the while, he continued to make veiled comments to Natalie about her true place in the Vanderford family. One evening, as Natalie was putting Alice to bed, the little girl looked up at her with worried eyes. "Is something bad going to happen?" she asked. "Daddy and Uncle Jason keep fighting." Natalie's heart ached for the child. "Everything will be all right," she said, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "Sometimes grown-ups disagree, but they'll work it out." As she closed Alice's door, Natalie made a decision. She had to confront Thomas about what was going on. She couldn't keep living in this web of secrets and half-truths, not when it was affecting Alice. She found Thomas in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand as he stared out the window. "Mr. Vanderford," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We need to talk." Thomas turned, his eyes weary. "Yes, Miss Thompson. I suppose we do." As Natalie stepped into the study, closing the door behind her, she knew that whatever came next would change everything. The truth about her past, her connection to the Vanderfords, and the mysterious inheritance was about to come to light. And with Jason's threatening presence looming over them all, Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of something dangerous. The tension that had been building in the Vanderford mansion finally reached a breaking point one balmy evening. Natalie found Thomas by the pool, his usual composed demeanor replaced by a look of weariness. The setting sun cast long shadows across the water, mirroring the dark mood that had settled over the estate. "Mr. Vanderford," Natalie began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I think it's time we talked about what's really going on here." Thomas turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. For a moment, he looked as if he might deflect, but then his shoulders sagged. "You're right, Miss Thompson. There's much I should have told you earlier." He gestured for her to sit on one of the poolside chairs. As they settled, Thomas began to speak, his voice low and tinged with regret. "I've known about your connection to our family for some time," he admitted. "When I hired you, it wasn't just for Alice's sake. I needed to understand who you were, what you knew." Natalie felt a surge of anger. "So I've been nothing more than an experiment to you? A way to protect your family's secrets?" Thomas shook his head vehemently. "No, it started that way, but things changed. You changed things, Natalie." The use of her first name caught her off guard. Thomas continued, his voice growing more passionate. "I've spent years building walls around myself, around Alice. After her mother left, I didn't know how to be the father she needed. But watching you with her, seeing the joy you've brought back into this house, it's made me realize how much I've been missing." Natalie felt her anger soften, replaced by a confusing mix of empathy and something else she wasn't ready to name. Thomas leaned closer, his eyes intense. "I'm afraid, Natalie. Afraid of losing everything I've built. Afraid of failing Alice. Afraid of these feelings I'm developing for you." The admission hung in the air between them. Natalie's breath caught in her throat as she realized how close they were sitting. She could see the flecks of gold in Thomas's eyes, feel the warmth radiating from his body. For a moment, It seemed as if Thomas might lean in further. But then, as if catching himself, he pulled back abruptly. "I'm sorry," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I shouldn't have said that. It's inappropriate, given our situation." Natalie stood up, her mind whirling. I need some time to process this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As she walked back to the house, Natalie's emotions were in turmoil. She had come here looking for answers about her past, about the mysterious inheritance. Instead, she found herself grappling with unexpected feelings for a man who had initially hired her under false pretenses. Later that night, as Natalie lay in bed, sleep eluding her, she replayed the conversation by the pool. Thomas's admission of his fears and feelings had caught her off guard. She had always seen him as the stern, distant employer. But now, she couldn't shake the image of his vulnerable expression, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her. But what about the inheritance? What about Jason's warnings? Natalie felt torn between her growing feelings for Thomas and her need to uncover the truth about her past. The next morning, Natalie went through her routine with Alice mechanically, her mind elsewhere. As they sat in the garden, working on Alice's reading, the little girl looked up at Natalie with concern. "Are you okay, Miss Natalie? You seem sad." Natalie forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about some grown-up stuff." Alice nodded solemnly. "Is it about Daddy? He looks at you the way he used to look at Mommy in the old pictures." The innocent observation hit Natalie like a punch to the gut. She realized that her feelings for Thomas weren't just affecting her. They had the potential to impact Alice as well. "Alice," Natalie said carefully, "you know I care about you very much, right?" The little girl nodded. "And nothing will ever change that. But sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings that can be confusing." Alice seemed to consider this. "Like how I sometimes feel happy and sad at the same time when I think about Mommy?" Natalie felt a lump form in her throat. "Yes, sweetheart. Exactly like that." As they continued with their lesson, Natalie couldn't shake the weight of her emotional turmoil. She had come to care deeply for Alice, viewing her almost as a daughter. The thought of potentially hurting her or disrupting her life with complicated adult emotions filled Natalie with guilt. Yet, she couldn't deny the pull she felt towards Thomas. Despite the secrets and the initial deception, she had seen a side of him that was vulnerable, caring, and deeply devoted to his daughter. As the day wore on, Natalie found herself avoiding both Thomas and Jason. She threw herself into her duties, trying to distract herself from the emotional whirlwind inside her. But everywhere she turned in the mansion, she was reminded of the complex web of relationships and secrets she had become entangled in. That night, as Natalie stood on her balcony, looking out at the moonlit ocean, she made a decision. She couldn't let her personal feelings cloud her judgment. There were still too many unanswered questions about her past and the mysterious inheritance. Before she could even consider exploring her feelings for Thomas, she needed to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. With renewed determination, Natalie resolved to confront both Thomas and Jason the next day. It was time to put all the cards on the table and face whatever consequences might come. Little did she know that her decision would set in motion a chain of events that would change all their lives forever. The following morning, Natalie woke with a sense of purpose. She was determined to confront both Thomas and Jason, to finally get to the bottom of the secrets surrounding her past and the Vanderford family. However, as she made her way downstairs, she sensed an unusual tension in the air. As she entered the dining room, she found Jason already seated, a smug smile playing on his lips. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. "Good morning, Natalie," Jason said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "I hope you slept well. You'll need your wits about you today." Before Natalie could respond, Thomas strode into the room, his face a mask of barely contained anger. He glanced at Natalie, his expression softening for a moment, before hardening again as he turned to Jason. "I thought I made myself clear last night," Thomas growled. "You have no right to interfere in my family's affairs." Jason leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "Oh, but dear cousin, I'm only looking out for the family's best interests. And Natalie here is family, isn't she? Even if she doesn't know it yet." Natalie's heart raced. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. Thomas turned to her, his eyes pleading. "Natalie, don't listen to him. He's trying to manipulate the situation for his own gain." Jason stood up, his charming facade dropping away. "Am I, Thomas? Or am I simply bringing the truth to light? Tell her. Tell her about the inheritance, about her real connection to this family." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Natalie looked between the two men, her mind whirling. "I want to know the truth," she said firmly. "All of it." Thomas sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Natalie, it's complicated. Your mother, she was my cousin. The inheritance you've heard about, it was meant to be split between our families. But my uncle, he—" Thomas trailed off, shame evident in his voice. Jason jumped in, his voice sharp. "His uncle, my father, hid the inheritance away. He manipulated the records, erased your family's claim, and Thomas here has known about it all along." Natalie felt as if the floor was tilting beneath her feet. "Is this true?" she asked Thomas, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I only found out recently. I was trying to find a way to make it right, to understand the full situation before I told you." Jason scoffed. "Make it right? By hiring her as a nanny? By keeping her in the dark?" The accusations hung in the air, heavy and damning. Natalie felt a surge of anger and betrayal. "You've been lying to me this whole time," she said to Thomas, her voice shaking. "Using me to what? Ease your conscience?" Thomas stepped towards her, his eyes pleading. "No, Natalie, it wasn't like that. I admit I made mistakes, but my feelings for you, for what you've brought to this family, they're real." Jason interjected, his voice smooth. "Don't let him fool you, Natalie. He's only interested in protecting his own interests, but I can help you claim what's rightfully yours." Natalie felt overwhelmed, torn between her feelings for Thomas and the anger at his deception. She turned and fled the room, needing space to think. As she hurried down the hallway, she could hear Thomas calling after her, but she didn't stop. She found herself in the library, surrounded by the very books and documents that held the secrets of her past. A few minutes later, Thomas entered the library, his face etched with concern and regret. "Natalie, please, let me explain." Natalie turned to face him, her emotions a turbulent mix of anger, confusion, and lingering affection. "Explain what, Thomas? How you've been lying to me since the day I arrived? How you used me to assuage your own guilt?" Thomas stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "It wasn't like that. Yes, I knew about your connection to the family when I hired you, but I never expected to feel this way about you." Natalie felt her resolve wavering at the sincerity in his voice, but she steeled herself. "And what about the inheritance? Were you ever going to tell me about that?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his gesture. "I was trying to find the right way, the right time. The situation is complex, Natalie. There are legal implications, family dynamics at play." "And where does that leave me?" Natalie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where do I fit into all of this?" Before Thomas could answer, Jason's voice cut through the tension. "It leaves you in a position of power, my dear Natalie." He sauntered into the library, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "With my help, you could claim everything that's rightfully yours." Thomas whirled to face his cousin, anger flashing in his eyes. "Stay out of this, Jason. You have no right to interfere." Jason's smile was cold. "Oh, but I do. You see, I have evidence of Uncle Robert's manipulations, evidence that could bring this whole charade crumbling down." As the two men faced off, Natalie felt as if she were watching a chess match where she was both a player and a pawn. The weight of the revelations, the tangled web of family secrets and hidden agendas, pressed down on her. In that moment, standing in the library surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the uncertain promises of the future, Natalie realized that her next move would change everything. The truth was finally coming to light, but at what cost? And more importantly, what would she do with that truth once she had it? The tension in the library was palpable as Natalie stood between Thomas and Jason, the weight of their revelations pressing down on her. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she knew would be a difficult conversation. "I want to see this evidence," Natalie said firmly, turning to Jason. "If what you're saying is true, I have a right to know." Jason's lips curled into a satisfied smirk. "Of course, my dear. I thought you might say that." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "It's all here. Bank statements, legal documents, even some rather incriminating letters from dear Uncle Robert." Thomas stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. "Natalie, please, be careful. Jason has his own agenda in all of this." "And you don't?" Natalie retorted, though her voice lacked the anger from before. She was tired, confused, and desperate for the truth. With trembling hands, Natalie opened the envelope and began to sift through its contents. As she read, her eyes widened. The documents painted a clear picture of deception and manipulation spanning decades. They showed how Thomas's uncle had systematically erased Natalie's family from the Vanderford history, redirecting a substantial fortune that should have been split between the two family lines. "This is overwhelming," Natalie murmured, looking up at Thomas. "Did you know the full extent of this?" Thomas's shoulders sagged. "I suspected, but I didn't have proof. That's why I've been investigating, trying to piece it all together." Jason chuckled darkly. "Oh, come now, Thomas. You've known for years. You just didn't want to give up your precious lifestyle." Natalie's mind raced. The fortune detailed in these documents was substantial, life-changing. But as she looked at Thomas, she saw not a greedy man clinging to wealth, but someone genuinely torn between duty and desire. "What happens now?" Natalie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason stepped closer, his voice smooth as silk. "Now, my dear, you claim what's rightfully yours, with my help, of course. For a reasonable percentage, I can ensure you get everything you're entitled to." Thomas's eyes flashed with anger. "And there it is, your true motive, Jason. You don't care about justice or family. You're just after the money." Natalie felt a headache building behind her eyes. The truth was finally in her hands, but it brought with it a host of new complications. She thought of Alice, of the life she'd built here at the mansion. Could she really tear it all apart for wealth and a sense of misplaced justice? "I need time to think," Natalie said, clutching the documents to her chest. "This isn't a decision I can make lightly." Jason's face darkened. "Don't take too long, Natalie. Opportunities like this don't come around often." As Jason left the library, Thomas turned to Natalie, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and hope. "Natalie, I know I've made mistakes. I should have been honest with you from the start. But please believe me when I say that my feelings for you, for what you've brought to this family, are real." Natalie felt her heart constrict. Despite everything, she couldn't deny the connection she felt with Thomas, the life she'd come to love here. But the weight of the truth, of her newfound heritage, pressed down on her. "I don't know what to do, Thomas," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "This is everything I've ever wanted to know about my past. But now that I have it, I'm not sure I want it." Thomas stepped closer, tentatively reaching out to touch her arm. Whatever you decide, know that you have a place here. Not as an employee, not as a long-lost relative, but as someone I've come to care for deeply. Natalie looked up at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a future here, with Thomas and Alice, the three of them forming a real family. But the documents in her hands reminded her of the complexity of their situation. "I need some air," Natalie said, stepping back. "I'm going for a walk. I need to clear my head." As she left the library, Natalie's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She had come to the Vanderford mansion seeking answers about her past, and now she had them. But those answers brought with them a host of new questions and moral dilemmas. Walking along the beach, the sound of waves crashing against the shore, Natalie grappled with her choices. She could claim her inheritance, potentially changing her life forever, but at what cost? Would she be tearing apart the very family she had come to love? As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the water, Natalie realized that the truth, long sought after, had brought her to a crossroads. Her decision would not only shape her own future, but the lives of Thomas, Alice, and the entire Vanderford legacy. With a deep breath, Natalie turned back towards the mansion, knowing that whatever choice she made would change everything. The truth was finally in her hands, but the real test would be what she chose to do with it. As Natalie approached the mansion, the warm glow of sunset giving way to twilight, she saw Thomas waiting for her on the terrace. His face was etched with concern and something else, a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Natalie," he called out softly as she climbed the steps. "I hope your walk helped clear your mind." She nodded, her resolve strengthening. "It did. I think it's time we talked, Thomas. Really talked." They made their way to Thomas's study, the room that had been the epicenter of so many secrets. As they settled into the leather armchairs, Natalie placed the envelope of documents on the desk between them. "I've made a decision," Natalie began, her voice steady. "But before I tell you what it is, I need to hear everything from you. No more half-truths or omissions." Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You're right. You deserve the whole truth." He took a deep breath before continuing. "When I first learned about your connection to our family, I was scared. Scared of losing everything I'd built, everything I thought was mine. That's why I hired you, to keep you close, to figure out what you knew." Natalie felt a pang in her chest but remained silent, allowing Thomas to continue. "But then I got to know you, saw how you were with Alice, how you brought life back into this house. My motivations changed. I wanted to protect you, to find a way to make things right without destroying what we had built here." "And the inheritance?" Natalie prompted. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "I've been working with lawyers, trying to find a way to restore your claim without legal repercussions. It's complicated, Natalie. The way my uncle hid the money, there could be serious consequences if it all came to light." Just then, a knock at the door interrupted them. Jason entered, his face a mask of false concern. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," he said, his tone making it clear he didn't care if he was. Natalie stood, facing both men. "Actually, your timing is perfect, Jason. I've made my decision about the inheritance." Jason's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "Excellent. I assume you'll be wanting my help to claim what's rightfully yours." "No," Natalie said firmly. "I've decided not to pursue the inheritance." The room fell silent. Jason's face contorted in disbelief and anger. "What? You can't be serious. After everything Thomas has done, you're just going to let him keep it all?" Thomas stood as well, moving to stand beside Natalie. "This is her decision, Jason. You have no say in the matter." Jason's charm fell away completely, replaced by a snarl. "You fool!" he spat at Natalie. "Do you have any idea what you're giving up? What I could do for you?" Natalie stood her ground. "I know exactly what I'm doing. This inheritance, it's tainted, built on lies and manipulation. I won't be a part of that." "Then I'll expose it all," Jason threatened. "I'll bring the whole Vanderford empire crashing down." It was Thomas who responded, his voice calm but firm. "No, you won't. Because if you do, you'll implicate yourself and your father in fraud and tax evasion. Those documents cut both ways, Jason." Jason's face paled as he realized the truth of Thomas's words. He looked from Thomas to Natalie, seeing a united front where he had hoped to sow discord. "This isn't over," Jason hissed, backing towards the door. "You haven't heard the last of me." As Jason stormed out, slamming the door behind him, Natalie felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She turned to Thomas, seeing a mix of gratitude and admiration in his eyes. "Natalie, I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem enough." She shook her head. "I didn't do it for you, Thomas. I did it for me, for Alice, for the life we built here. But," she added, her tone growing serious, "this doesn't erase the lies or the hurt." Thomas nodded solemnly. "I know, and I want to make it right. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I want to earn your trust back. Not just for me, but for our family." The word family hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Natalie felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized that, for the first time in her life, she truly understood what that word meant. "It won't be easy," she said softly. "We have a lot to work through." Thomas reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I know, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. You and Alice, you're everything to me." As they stood there, hands clasped, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the study windows, Natalie knew that while the confrontation was over, their journey was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead, trust to rebuild, and a family to forge. But for the first time since she'd arrived at the Vanderford mansion, Natalie felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The days following Jason's departure were filled with a tense calm. Natalie and Thomas worked to rebuild their trust, spending long hours in conversation, addressing the lies and secrets that had clouded their relationship. Alice, sensing the shift in the household's dynamics, seemed to blossom under the newfound honesty and warmth between the adults in her life. However, their fragile peace was shattered one crisp morning when a fleet of expensive cars pulled up to the mansion. Thomas, who had been expecting this day, met Natalie in the foyer, his face grim. "They're here," he said quietly. "The board of directors and some distant relatives. Jason must have stirred them up." Natalie straightened her shoulders. "What do they want?" "To challenge my control of the company, I suspect, and possibly to investigate the rumors about the hidden inheritance." As the doorbell rang, Thomas took Natalie's hand, squeezing it gently. "Whatever happens, we face this together." The next few hours were a whirlwind of accusations, legal jargon, and thinly veiled threats. The board members and relatives, led by a sharp-tongued woman named Victoria Vanderford, crowded into the large living room. Their eyes darted between Thomas and Natalie, clearly trying to parse the nature of their relationship. Victoria, a severe-looking woman in her 60s, stepped forward. "Thomas, darling, we've heard some rather disturbing rumors. Something about a hidden inheritance and a long-lost relative?" Her gaze settled on Natalie, cold and calculating. Thomas stood firm. "Whatever you've heard, Victoria, I can assure you that the company's finances are in order. As for Natalie's presence here, that's a private family matter." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Family matter? So it's true then. This woman is laying claim to the Vanderford fortune?" Natalie, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. My name is Natalie Thompson, and yes, I am related to the Vanderfords, but I'm not here to lay claim to anything." The room fell silent, all eyes on Natalie. She took a deep breath and continued, "I came here seeking answers about my past, and I found them. But I also found something more valuable, a family." Victoria scoffed. "How convenient. And I suppose Thomas here has been more than accommodating?" Thomas moved to stand beside Natalie. "I've made mistakes, Victoria, mistakes I'm working to rectify, but Natalie's presence in this family is not one of them." Just then, the door burst open and Jason strode in, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Oh, don't let them fool you," he announced to the room. "I have proof of the deception, the hidden accounts, all of it." He pulled out a stack of documents, waving them dramatically. "It's all here. How Uncle Robert hid the money, how Thomas knew about it all along. This little gold digger," he pointed at Natalie, "is just the latest in a long line of Vanderford secrets." The room erupted in chaos. Board members shouted questions, relatives gasped in shock, and Victoria's face turned an alarming shade of red. Amidst the uproar, a clear voice cut through the noise. "That's enough." All heads turned to see Alice standing in the doorway, her small frame vibrating with anger. "Stop being mean to my mom and dad." The room fell silent, stunned by the child's outburst. Natalie and Thomas exchanged a look of surprise and warmth at Alice's words. Taking advantage of the silence, Thomas addressed the room. "Yes, there have been secrets in this family. Yes, mistakes were made, but Natalie and I are committed to making things right." He turned to the board members. "I propose a full audit of the company's finances. Every account, every transaction will be open for review. And as for the inheritance," he looked at Natalie, who nodded her agreement, "we'll be setting up a charitable foundation in the name of both Vanderford and Thompson families, to right the wrongs of the past and create a legacy we can all be proud of." The room buzzed with whispered conversations. Victoria stepped forward, her expression a mix of grudging respect and lingering suspicion. "And what of the company leadership?" Thomas squared his shoulders. "I'm prepared to step down if the board feels it's necessary, but I ask for the chance to lead us through this transition, to make things right." As the discussions continued, Natalie felt a small hand slip into hers. She looked down to see Alice smiling up at her. "Did you mean it?" Natalie asked softly. "About us being your mom and dad?" Alice nodded solemnly. "You're my family now, both of you." Tears pricked at Natalie's eyes as she pulled Alice close. Thomas joined them, wrapping his arms around both of them. In that moment, as the future of the Vanderford Empire hung in the balance, Natalie realized that she had found something far more valuable than any inheritance: a true family, built on love, trust, and the strength to face the truth together. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be legal battles, public scrutiny, and trust to rebuild. But as Natalie stood there, embraced by Thomas and Alice, she knew that together they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the tense negotiations in the Vanderford mansion continued, the atmosphere was suddenly disrupted by the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside. Moments later, the front door burst open, and a woman in her late 40s strode into the room, her presence commanding immediate attention. "I believe this meeting is missing a key participant," she announced, her voice clear and authoritative. Thomas's face paled, as if he'd seen a ghost. "Elizabeth?" he whispered, his voice a mixture of disbelief and shock. The woman, Elizabeth, surveyed the room, her gaze lingering on Natalie and Alice before settling on Thomas. "Hello, brother. It's been a long time." The room erupted into chaos once again. Victoria stepped forward, her voice shrill with indignation. "What is the meaning of this? Elizabeth Vanderford has been missing for years." Elizabeth's lips curved into a wry smile. Missing, yes, but very much alive and ready to reclaim my place in this family. She pulled out a leather briefcase and addressed the stunned audience. I am Elizabeth Vanderford, Thomas's sister, and I bring with me the final pieces of this complicated puzzle. Opening the briefcase, Elizabeth extracted a stack of documents. These papers prove not only my identity, but also reveal the true extent of our uncle's deception, the inheritance that's caused so much strife. It was never meant for just one branch of the family. Thomas, still visibly shaken, moved closer to Elizabeth. Where have you been all these years? We thought you were dead. Elizabeth's expression softened slightly. That was the intention, wasn't it? Uncle Robert's final manipulation. He arranged my disappearance to consolidate his control over the family fortune. I've spent years gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to return and set things right. She turned to Natalie, her gaze appraising. And you must be the missing piece. Natalie Thompson, I presume. Natalie nodded, still trying to process this new development. Elizabeth continued, Your mother was my best friend. I've been searching for you for years, hoping to reunite you with your rightful heritage. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Board members huddled in hurried conversations, while family members stared at Elizabeth in disbelief. Jason, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly found his voice. This changes nothing. The company is still in shambles, the reputation tarnished. Elizabeth fixed him with a steely gaze. On the contrary, cousin, this changes everything. With these documents, we can finally untangle the web of lies and restore the Vanderford name, all branches of it. She turned to address the board members and family. I propose a restructuring of the Vanderford empire, one that honors our shared heritage and looks to the future. Thomas and I will lead the transition, with Natalie playing a key role in our new charitable foundation. Victoria, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. And what guarantee do we have that this isn't just another layer of deception? Elizabeth smiled, pulling out one final document. This, Victoria, is a DNA test, proof of my identity and my relation to both Thomas and Natalie. I've nothing to hide and everything to gain by bringing our family back together. As the implications of Elizabeth's words sank in, the mood in the room began to shift. The anger and suspicion gave way to cautious optimism and a sense of possibility. Thomas, who had been silent for some time, finally spoke. Elizabeth, I don't know what to say, but I'm glad you're home. He turned to Natalie and Alice, who had been watching the proceedings with wide eyes. It seems our family just got a little bigger. Natalie, still processing the sudden turn of events, felt a mix of emotions. The aunt she never knew she had was now standing before her, offering a connection to her past and a path to the future. Alice, with the directness only a child could muster, broke the tension. Does this mean I have two moms now? The room erupted in laughter, the sound breaking through the last of the tension. Elizabeth knelt down to Alice's level, her eyes warm. It means you have a very big, very complicated, but very loving family. As the group began to discuss the details of the restructuring and the future of the Vanderford empire, Natalie found herself at the center of a family she never knew she had. Thomas stood on one side, his hand reassuringly on her back, while Elizabeth stood on the other, a living link to her mother's past. The road ahead would be challenging. There were legal hurdles to overcome, relationships to rebuild, and a family legacy to redefine. But as Natalie looked around at the faces of her newfound family, Thomas, Alice, and now Elizabeth, she felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. The truth had finally come to light, bringing with it not just answers, but a future full of possibilities. The Vanderford mansion, once a place of secrets and lies, was now poised to become the heart of a reunited family, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together,